We're good now.
Oh, is it called We're Good Now? What's it called?
The sound wasn't on.
Hello, welcome. If you're still watching, if you haven't given up, we're still here. Welcome to Labrie. I'm not going to say the whole thing again. My name is Joshua Chestnut. This lecture tonight is called On Being Politically Homeless. It's part of our fall lecture series. There's a few more coming up. Next week is Dave Friedrich on Sabbath. And then 2 weeks from now is Dick Kai's on outrage. So exciting things, good thought-inducing Friday evenings. So mark your calendars. Yeah. But as you've probably heard, there is an election going on right now. You might have heard this. It's a big thing on Twitter. People are talking about this. But it struck me today that we are under 20 days away from the election. And this has felt like a long season in any number of ways. With COVID, with all of the economic collapse that happened, the racial awakening and protests that happened this summer. Lots of things have been going on apart from this. So I speak just knowing that people are exhausted already, and exhausted from all those other things, but also this topic. So I just want to acknowledge that. I know it can be a heavy thing. But I want to jump in. And for those watching on Facebook, we had a little malfunction. My PowerPoint slides couldn't get on the live stream on the video, but there's some video or slides here. But anyway, you'll just have to imagine when they come in. But as a way in, I want to use this quote from C.S. Lewis in his essay called Membership. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, "A sick society must think much about politics, as a sick man must think much about his digestion. To ignore the subject may be fatal cowardice for the one as for the other. But if either comes to regard it as the natural food of the mind, if either forgets that we think of such things only in order to be able to think of something else, then that which was undertaken for the sake of health has itself become a new and deadly disease." Yeah, it's timely. I think it's good. And as fraught and as complicated as politics in America are right now, it would be easy to stick our heads in the sand, sort of wish a pox on both parties until the election is done. But our society is sick. And so for the sake of our national health, we need to think about political matters. We need to do some real thinking and also engage in some real action. The temptation, the understandable temptation to avoid politics altogether can be cowardice and lethal. But at the same time, Lewis's words are a real warning for those of us who have become singularly fixated on politics, especially over the last 4 years. And we've allowed political discourse in America to have a larger role in the formation of our self-understanding and our identity than I think it should. Lewis's words remind us that our self-righteous social media silos, our angry partisan infotainment, thinking here of Fox News, MSNBC, the president's unhinged and undisciplined Twitter feed, none of this is the natural food of the mind. We think about political matters so that we can think about other matters. Things that matter to us, our neighbors, our friends, professional basketball, music, art, food, the good things in life. My fear is that of these two propensities, the second one, gorging ourselves on what is not the natural food of the mind, is our proclivity right now. And it is only prolonging and worsening our society's illness. My concern is that in the way that partisan politics and their respective media extensions have captured and hold captive our political imaginations and our moral vision, especially for people of faith. I don't exempt myself from this. I'm not free from hypocrisy, from defensiveness, from tribal loyalty. These are issues I'm learning to deal with myself. But my thesis tonight is simple enough, I hope. As Christians, we do not believe certain things, behave in certain ways, or vote along certain lines because we belong to political parties or political groups. The word belong is crucial here. Belonging is a word about identity formation. Who we belong to is part of who we are. As Christians, we don't need to find our belonging through political affiliation, especially the partisan political affiliation today. And we don't gain our moral vision from certain political platforms. As self-evident as this might seem, I think it is worth saying. Because we all too often have the matter backwards. We behave in certain ways, we vote in certain ways, we believe certain things to be true because we understand ourselves to be members of political parties. But as members of the body of Christ, we join the work of political parties or groups because of what we already believe, because we already have a belonging, an identity, a moral vision, and a cause that has been given to us from somewhere else. Political parties have been so effective in capturing our political imaginations and shaping our moral vision. And by that, I just mean the things we really care about, what we think matters, what is right, what is wrong, what we care for. I think they've captured these things for a multitude of reasons, but the one I want to talk about tonight is the fact that so many of us feel like we're lost in the cosmos. We experience our world as a place of existential and spiritual alienation. We're looking for a cause. We're looking for a belonging. We're looking for a tribe. We're looking for an identity that can tether us down to earth and help us step into our own lives with some sort of purpose. And angry partisan politics can really provide an avenue for this, for all sorts of people, for so many of us. So this is sort of my way in, and this is where I want to go with the rest of our time. I want to talk about an idea of existential homelessness. I want to look at 5 political impulses of the early Christian movement. I want to consider how to vote, how not to vote, maybe. And then briefly end with a liturgical audit for this election season. So we're going to start with existential homelessness. So there is a concept, a word that comes from Sigmund Freud, and it's been rattling around in my head for the last few years. And with any apologies to any remaining Freudians out there, just in general, but in particular, because I'm not really going to use the word the way Freud uses the word. I just like the word. I think it's just a good word, and it's a word that has helped me make sense of both our cultural moment, with all its contingencies, with all its anger and outrage, and it's also helped me make sense of something more basic about the human condition, something that is perhaps more universal, something that's true about myself as well. And so the word is unheimlich. I like saying the word unheimlich. If maybe there's German speakers here or elsewhere and I've mispronounced it, please tell me later in private. But the word literally means unhomey, not at home. It's often translated in Freudian psychology as the uncanny. I'm not using it in that sense. But to situate this word and why I think this word is helpful, I think it's worth noting we all have moments where we experience our corner of the world in a way that everything feels right. Things are as they should be. And in those moments, we pause to give thanks. We step back to sort of take it all in. We slow down to suck it all up, or just to soak it all up, not suck it all up. But yeah, maybe we suck it up. I don't know. But in these moments, we are known and we're safe. There is meaning. There is abundant goodness. There is delight. We belong. We belong and have this sense of being at home. Maybe you get this sitting around a campfire with friends, an evening a long evening with good food and good wine and good conversation around a table. Maybe you feel it when you stand on the precipice of a mountain that you just climbed and you look out over the horizon and it's just so far and so vast. Maybe it's watching your child sleep, finally sleep. Maybe it's you feel this when you stand back after completing a project. You just made something, you did something. You completed a book manuscript. You made a shelf that the book manuscript can sit on. You painted a room that the shelf that the manuscript's sitting on can all be in. These are things we feel good. We feel things are right in the world. But however long these moments last, they slip through our fingers. Reality eventually comes rushing back. It's not always hard and painful and difficult, but it can turn into the mundane, the predictable. But it can be painful. The dinner ends. The shelf gets broken. The book proposal doesn't get accepted. Our children wake up and immediately disobey us. We lose a job. We are betrayed by a friend. We get a terrible diagnosis. And so we know that the world is just unheimlich. It's not homey. It's not comfy. And the idea with this is that it should be. It could be. It's not just that it's uncomfortable, but that it doesn't have to be this way. It should be different. And it's disorienting because when we experience something like this, it feels like we've been kicked out of a place where we belonged. Writing really in light of the fact that there's over 65 million refugees in the world today, commentator Ian Chambers reminds us that to be a stranger in a strange land, to be lost, is perhaps the condition most typical of contemporary life. But Chambers speaks of this sojourner-like condition, not being at home. He says it doesn't just characterize those who've had to leave their actual homes because of wars they didn't start, because of famines, because of natural disasters, because of some form of persecution. He says the migrant's sense of being rootless, of living between worlds, between a lost past and a non-integrated present, is perhaps the most fitting metaphor of this postmodern condition. This sense of a lost past and a non-integrated present is difficult. It is exhausting for so many of us. It's not homey. We don't like this. Humans are meaning-making creatures, and as strangers in a strange land, we can scan our horizon looking for a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a cause, a purpose. We look for a home. This was the way 4th century North African theologian and bishop Augustine understood his life. He told the story of his life as all these are points of arrival. He left his small home, he pursued life in the big city, he pursued relationships, he pursued a respectable career, he pursued philosophical community, and in each one of these stations, each one of these places, the question he was asking was, will you give me rest? Will this be a home to me? And you should read the Confessions time and again. It's like that for a while, but it doesn't last. His heart is restless. It's looking for a place for rest. It's looking for a home. And jumping from the 4th century to today, I think our political parties aren't just presenting us with unbiased, scientifically deduced platforms or policies. They're not even really offering us electable politicians these days. But to so many of us who feel adrift in the world, lost in the cosmos, existentially homeless, they're offering us a sense of home, a way to belong, a cause to get behind. And this is a powerful offer, even if it's only made implicitly. This sense of belonging, of identity, of purpose is a path that helps us navigate the unheimlich of our world. These were the sorts of things that were once sort of the bread and butter of religion. Meaning, purpose, community, rituals. These are part and parcel of what our political parties or our political affiliations are offering us today. And on top of this, not only do they offer us this sense of home and belonging, they each sort of come with something that would be akin to what Christian theologians call the fall. a fall narrative, the reason why things are bad in your life and bad in the world. It's often either oppressive conservatives or these deconstructing liberals, right? They are the ones. So these parties offer us meaning, but they also offer us an enemy. And the power of having a shared enemy, it's compelling, but it also blinds us in many ways. It blinds us to reality. This is articulated in what Alan Jacobs, in his book, How to Think, calls the logic of the repugnant cultural other. The repugnant cultural other. He writes about this, and he says this sort of way of thinking prevents us from recognizing others as our neighbors, even when they are quite literally our neighbors. If I'm consumed by this belief that that person over there is both other and repugnant, I may never discover that my favorite TV show is also their favorite TV show. That we like some of the same books, though not precisely for the same reasons. That we know what it's like to nurse a loved one through a long illness. All of which is to say, I may all too easily forget that political and social and religious differences are not the whole of human experience. And this also keeps us from asking questions of why would someone be such a repugnant cultural other? Why would they choose to belong elsewhere, to that other side? It blinds us from that. It blinds us from the fact that often they're just as lost in the cosmos as we are, as we feel. And this existential sense of a home and a belonging that the parties offer us, it doesn't just blind us to others, it actually binds us together, which what I might call the agreeable cultural equivalent, someone who is pretty much just like me on all the issues that I think are the important issues. There's this powerful binding effect. It blinds us and it binds us. And it binds us to choose often our tribe, those who we think we belong to, over the truth. Or, in the words and the research of Jeffrey Cohen, party over policy. Has anyone heard of the party over policy study? Cohen was a researcher at Yale in the early 2000s, and he gave a group of people two very different welfare policy proposals. One of them rather stringent, sort of stereotypically Republican. The other quite generous, stereotypically Democrat. Cohen gave out these proposals to the participants, but he randomly assigned the policies with a party. So this one is the Republican Party, even if the sort of substance of it wasn't. And this one's the Democratic policy, even if it's not. And even when the policies didn't align with the stereotypical or traditional party ideology, Cohen found that those participating, almost without fail, approved the policy they were told belonged to their party, even when the policy didn't match or align with the said party's normal approach. Cohen was really surprised by this, and he kept giving more and more information, hoping to sway them. But participants dug their heels in and kept choosing the policies that they were told matched their parties. He took it even one step further. He challenged them. He said, you need to write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper in favor of this policy. And these people wrote heartfelt letters, believing their letters could maybe sway public opinion. But they wrote letters for policies that didn't even align with their party's normal stance. There's so much to say, I think, about this study. I think it shows us lots of things. It's provocative. But it points to the way that our political involvement is not simply a way to pursue a common good, a way for us to sort of get things done in the world. It shows a way in which we find our belonging. In this matter, our parties aren't merely dispensing policies and platforms. They're sort of like existential real estate agents. They're realtors. They're offering us a place to live, a place to stay, a belonging, an identity, a cause, this sense of a home that we want. And I think we could all naturally take the next step that if politicians are like realtors, they're probably also like slumlords, right? They don't really care about the people who live in the homes they provide. They're motivated by greed or something else. But my concern is not just that the parties have become realtors and slumlords. I think they dictate what political allegiance looks like. And they act more like a strict homeowners association than even a slumlord. The purpose of a homeowners association is to manage the way a neighborhood appears. So whether it's the colors you can paint your house, how high your mailbox can be, sort of whether or not you can hang laundry out on the back line. If you want to live in this place, in this neighborhood, you have to abide by the homeowners association's rules on what's acceptable. So they dictate how we can act, how we can think, what we believe, what is important to us. This is the idea of giving us a moral vision. But I want to say again, as Christians, we don't believe certain things or behave in certain ways or vote in ways because we belong to political parties or groups. As members of the body of Christ, we join political parties because of something we already believe, because we have a belonging elsewhere. Christians are not pro-life because the Republican Party is pro-life. We were pro-life long before the Republicans were interested in this. And if it becomes less politically expedient, we will continue to be so. And in the same way, if we believe in the dignity of all people, as Christians, we also fight to end racism. And we don't do that just because we belong to the Democratic platform. We do that because of something we already believe before we enter into this. One of my favorite ways of sort of conceiving how we get an identity from elsewhere, how we belong elsewhere, is through Paul's image in his letter to the Philippians that we're citizens of heaven. This was one of my least favorite verses or ideas in the Bible for a long time because it seemed to imply like our citizenship is there, so we should just like worry about there and we don't have to worry about stuff here. But I think that has Paul's image backwards. I think it's not quite right. So Philippi was a Roman colony, and what that meant was that though they existed outside of the official boundaries of the Roman Empire, they were given all the benefits of Rome. They were given citizenship, even though they lived outside of it, which meant they don't have to pay taxes, the military will protect them, they get all of the good things being in the empire offers. But the way the deal worked was what they had to do to receive that, to be citizens, to be this colony, they had to spread the culture of Rome to the world that was around them. So through architecture, through art, through philosophy, through cuisine, through all of these things, they spread the culture of Rome. They get the benefits of Rome. This is what citizenship looked like for people in a colony like Philippi. So I think Paul's image here is that as citizens of heaven, we get the benefits from heaven, but our work is to spread the culture of heaven here on earth, where we find ourselves. Which brings me to a fascinating book called Destroyer of the Gods by historian Larry Hurtado, Early Christian Distinctiveness in the Roman World. This is Baylor Press, I think 2017 or 2016. And Hurtado, in this fascinating book that has nothing directly to do with the topic we're talking about tonight, but I think can point us in some helpful directions. He's trying to answer the question of why on earth did people become Christians in the first few centuries? There was no social benefit, no social capital, but Christianity had this crazy rise in the Roman Empire. Why were people converting? And Hurtado offers a lot of different things, but part of it is the distinctive social group, the distinctive social project that Christianity was. And he highlights many things. I want to look at 5 characteristics of this community to sort of see what maybe we could call their political impulses, what motivated them. So the first thing is that they are a multiracial and multi-ethnic community. Hurtado writes that in the Roman era, as was typical throughout antiquity and in many societies to this day, what we would call religious identity was conferred at birth. At the same time, in the same moment, that one's ethnic identity was conferred. This is because the gods were always linked to ethnic groups and were just part of this package deal. Religion and ethnicity in the ancient world belonged together. Your ethnicity would determine your religion, so these things went hand in hand. But then Hurtado comments about how along come these Christians, and they make this audacious claim that there's actually only one God over all these local and regional gods, and that all people should put their faith in him. Hurtado insists that this manner of a trans-ethnic religious group was a Christian innovation in the Roman world. Hurtado writes, early Christian religious identity was not tied to one's ethnicity and did not involve a connection to a particular ethnic group. Early Christian associations cut across ethnic lines, taking in people of various nations, their only connection to believers in other places and other nations being a shared religious commitment. We can see some of this idea in Ephesians 2. We can see it in Paul's description of communities in Romans 16. There's more to say, but we're going to keep going. The second characteristic, the second political impulse, was a commitment to care for the poor and the marginalized. While it was customary in the ancient world to care for members of one's own family or kin group that were poor, the idea of caring for anyone who was poor was shocking and was considered completely foolish. The early Christians would help anyone who was in need. The pagan emperor Julian famously derided Christians for foolishly not only caring for their own poor, but for caring for our poor as well. Questions of deserving poor versus undeserving poor, which take up way too much space in many Christian communities today, don't seem to be part of what animated the earliest Christians. They cared for all people. That didn't work into their moral calculus. The third characteristic that I think is worth noting is non-retaliation, a commitment to forgiveness. This is a generous spirit. Unlike so much of the ancient world, if you killed or attacked Christians in the first few centuries, their response was not revenge. Christians didn't organize and retaliate when they were attacked. Early Christians weren't strategic in getting revenge, but in fact, they placed a high value on following Jesus' call to love their enemies, even if their enemies were the culturally repugnant others. And not to just love them, but to forgive them. This was in part because this was a community that understood themselves as forgiven people. The next thing is early Christians were unambiguously against abortion and infanticide. I think to sort of give a picture, we need to back up a little bit to get our heads around what the culture the early Christians emerged in was like. These are a few lines from a Roman man who Hurtado quotes, named Hilaron. He's writing a letter to his wife, Alice. This is around 1 BC, they think. And he greets his wife, and he greets other relatives who live in their home. And then he begs her, Hilaron begs her, to take care of our little one, presumably their child. He promises to send money as soon as he gets paid. And then he refers to Alice's pregnancy and her fast approaching birth. And he writes, if it's a boy, let it be. If it's a girl, cast it out. As harsh as this sounds, directly after this, he goes on to express tender affection for Alice. How could I ever forget you? I beg you not to be anxious about all of these things. Hurtado notes that obviously this man was not a monster. He was capable of expressing tender feelings. But he wasn't unusual in his time to speak about infant exposure. Now, the reasons for infanticide or exposure as well as abortion are often hidden from us in antiquity. But historians believe that it was often very similar to situations today. It's due to poverty and scarce resources. Yet in Hilaron and Alice's case, it's gendered. If the child was to be a boy, they would keep it. If it was a girl, they would expose it. And the three likely endings to an exposed child would be one, that it would die fairly soon after. The second is the child would be found by a slaver and sold into slavery. Hurtado notes that the Roman Empire needed around 500,000 new slaves annually. The third option was that the child would be found by a slaver and sold into a brothel. There is no Roman law against this practice. Hurtado writes, while there wasn't much disapproval, there probably was grief. There was not very much shame. In the words of another scholar, though, when it comes to Christians, we come to a distinct parting of ways between Christians and the general Greco-Roman practice around this. Christians had skin in the game. They selflessly took in these exposed children into their homes and into their communities. There were no means by which this culturally insignificant and marginalized group could elect a senator who could sort of change the laws about this. Their power to change this situation was the power of their own homes, their own table, and extending that and welcoming that to these exposed children. There's more to say about all of these things. The last characteristic is that early Christians were a sexual counterculture. As a matter of context, listen to the words of 4th century orator Demosthenes. He says, "We men have concubines for pleasure, female slaves for our daily care," which is a sexual euphemism, "and wives to give us legitimate children and to be guardians of our household." When it comes to human sexuality and Roman law in the world that the Christians emerged in, Harvey Weinstein would have been the quintessential Roman man. Hurtado writes, he doesn't say that, I said that, but Hurtado writes, "Sex with prostitutes and courtesans and young boys was not only tolerated and even affirmed, it was affirmed as a hedge against adultery, against porneia." This idea of porneia, which was something a free man could only engage in, could only be accused of if he slept with another man's wife or a free-born virgin. Other than that, men sort of had their choice of whatever they wanted to do. And it wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. The sexual use and abuse of children fills the lyrics of pagan writers of the day like Juvenal, Petronius, Horace, Strato, Lucian, and the list goes on. Hurtado actually works with some other scholars, and he says the language against the abuse of children in the Roman world originates in Christian community. There wasn't even language to negatively describe this behavior. This was a Christian innovation and distinctive in the ancient world. It was without precedent. And part of this sexual counterculture is highlighted well in a different book by another historian named Kyle Harper. His book, From Shame to Sin. And so what Harper is after in this book, one of the things he wants to say is that teaching of Paul, that I used the word porneia before, adultery. Paul did something radical in the ancient world. He said, apart from the sexual activity between a man and a woman within marriage that was consensual, any sexual behavior outside of that is porneia, is off limits. And this was a radically democratizing ethic in a way, because in the ancient world, women and children and slaves had no power to resist. So Paul is equalizing the fields here in some ways. Harper spends a fair bit of time talking about ancient virgins that we tend to read, or virgins in the early church, we tend to read through the lens of purity culture and of discomfort with one's body or asceticism. And he said that's missing the point. In the sexual economies of Rome, women had no say over their bodies. And he said it was in these Pauline communities that women were able to say, this is my body, you can't touch it. Paul is taking away enormous power from upper class men in the Roman world through his sexual ethic. So these are 5 characteristics of what the early church looked like in some way. 5 political and social proclivities or impulses. This is how they did politics. And this completely defies the standard approaches of the left and the right today. Early Christians were multicultural, they cared for the poor, they extended forgiveness, they were ideologically and practically pro-life, and they embodied a sexual counterculture. Where do you see this sort of moral vision or political imagination? Who runs on a sort of ticket like this? Maybe Kanye West? He's got a very, very vague policies, but they're interesting. Or the American Solidarity Party. It's just clearly not the sort of political priorities that the Republicans or the Democrats are on about. The first two might sound like they're progressive, and the second two might sound, or the last two might sound like they're conservative. But all the while, the middle one doesn't sound like anyone. Forgiveness, kindness, non-retaliation, especially to enemies, this sounds like no one today. This middle characteristic is an affront to the prized virtue of both the left and the right, of outrage, of gracelessness, and of dismissal of the repugnant cultural other. Self-righteous outrage hinders humility and self-examination, but it's all over the performative politics of Washington, and it's all over my Twitter feed. And it's coming as much from the White House or from cultures of cultural Christianity as it is from sort of radical left cancel culture, whatever that is. The tendency to make precious and indulge our outrage, of course, helps us feel good. And there are very legitimate reasons for many people to be angry right now. I'm not trying to sort of make a blanket dismissal of anger. But there is this anger that is in the air that we can inherit. But it insulates us, I believe. It blinds us from the necessary political work of self-examination. And self-examination is an impulse, is a virtue that only comes if we have a solid or stable sense of self. When we can be critiqued, when we can listen to it, when we can take it seriously and not just throw whataboutisms back at people. This manner of politics that the early Christians were on about, this way of following Jesus, it was offensive, but it was also compelling to the ancient world. And it questions the legitimacy and the adequacy of both political parties. Michael Ware, Justin Givney, and Chris Butler, in their great book, Compassion and Conviction. This comes out of a political think tank organization called the AND Campaign that I think has been one of the most helpful voices in my life over the last 4 years, really since 2016. They're a wonderful organization. They have podcasts, lots of resources. But this summer they released this book that I highly recommend. And they say in here, there's nothing wrong with being conflicted about how both parties are right in part and wrong in part. The bigger problem is when Christians are unaware or unbothered by the faults on the side they prefer. This isn't to suggest a false equivalency between the two parties. One party might be wrong on more issues at a given time, but we must realize both fall well short of the biblical standard. They go on to say, when it comes to political ideology today, to be conservative or progressive at all times and on every issue is not only to be intellectually lazy and easily manipulated, it is also unfaithful. Theological conservatism and ideological conservatism are not the same thing. The far left's conception of social justice isn't always consistent with a biblical understanding. Christians' moral vision, our political imagination, don't need to be beholden to the major party platforms, to their priorities. That's because politics needs to be reframed, Gibney, Ware, and Butler argue, as a limited but essential forum for pursuing the well-being of our neighbors. It is limited in both its scope and its effectiveness. And part of, I think, its major limitation we see in the act of voting. And so I want to transition into having some thoughts on voting. I'm going to drink water for 1 second. We live in an age that places a tremendously high value on self-expression. From the sort of diet we want to follow, the clothes we want to wear, the music we want to listen to, whether we're iPhone people, whether we're Android people, all of these decisions we make to some extent we understand as expressing our identity, who we are. So in this climate, it's understandable for us to assume that politics, and in particular, the act of voting, is just another forum for self-expression, perhaps even self-actualization. Our vote carries the weight of who we are. This places a tremendous moral burden upon our vote. It goes without saying that our vote should have some sense of a moral burden. Voting is a serious issue. I don't want to imply that there's no moral burden. Yet the sort of moral burden that voting as self-expression carries with it is ill-fitted. This way of understanding voting is not in the best interest of voters, nor is it inherently a part of our politics, but it is quite beneficial to the interests of political parties, because it pushes us towards a wholesale endorsement. It pushes us, if this vote is me expressing who I am, and I'm voting for this person, it pushes us towards that sense of belonging. Michael Ware, who is a member of the AND campaign, actually he just left the AND campaign this week to do another thing, which was a blow to me, but he's a very helpful political thinker. He reminds us that your vote is not an unmediated expression of your identity. Your vote is a choice between options you didn't choose yourself. If you view your vote as an educated, pure expression of your will, it can be debilitating. To stick with our imagery here of homes and real estate agents and homeowner associations, your vote is not proof of your residency. It doesn't need to be understood as evidence of where you belong primarily. Ware goes on, he says, for Christians for whom faithfulness is both means and end, to view your vote as a totalizing statement of who you are, what you believe, inevitably leads to disintegration. The disintegration happens because if my vote is an expression of who I am, of where I belong, it makes the necessary political work of critique very difficult, especially critiquing one's own side. And so this disintegration is probably fairly familiar to many of us. This need to excuse, to explain away, to overlook, and even defend a party or a candidate when they are manifestly a moral nightmare. Because we did not choose the candidates who will represent us, we need not understand our vote as a proof of residence in their tribe, a full expression of where we belong. A vote is neither a complete endorsement, and it's not a means of self-expression. It is a limited but effective means by which we can love our neighbor and pursue human flourishing through electing capable representatives whose policies promote justice.
Can you repeat that, please?
Yes. It is a limited but effective means by which we can love our neighbors and pursue human flourishing through electing capable representatives whose policies promote justice. Now, a lot of influential and vocal evangelical leaders like John MacArthur, Eric Metaxas, Al Mohler, Franklin Graham, and until recently, Jerry Falwell Jr. And if you don't know who any of those people are, you don't need to Google them, it's okay. But they have made very strong cases. They've made it clear that the only vote cast in good faith can be for the sitting president. Their rationale is usually framed through the lens of abortion, though Falwell was more direct about the economy. So they prioritize one of the 5 political impulses that animated early Christians, that grew out of a biblical vision. For these men to vote for 45 a second time appears to be a way to express our faith and show where we belong. This, and I want to be careful with my words here, I think this is cowardly nonsense. I think it is manipulative, it is self-serving, it is narrow-minded, and it is beholden to a partisan belonging that Christians don't need. The words and actions of these Christian leaders are profoundly disappointing, if for no other reason is that they have come alongside with an overlooking, an excusing, and even defending the manifestly undisciplined, corrupt, misogynistic, egotistical, racist, divisive, and petty nature of our president. It has perhaps afforded them something they didn't have before, proximity to power, but it has cost them a coherent sense of moral authority by endorsing without critique. The president now represents them, is part of their self-expression. And if Christians are unable to critique a president that they have perhaps voted for, because voting in their minds is some sense of an expression of who they are and of where they belong, it doesn't take long to see what sort of trouble we have gotten ourselves into. No matter his stance on abortion, religious liberty, or the economy, a president who has repeatedly neglected pro-democracy, pro-human rights activists in Hong Kong, who has remained silent on the estimated million-plus Uyghur Muslims who are literally in concentration camps right now in China, who has blamed an incoherent response to a global pandemic on others, who has closed the door of our country to legitimate refugee seekers, many of whom are Christians, who has empowered and emboldened white supremacist groups throughout the country, all the while normalizing a political discourse that is undisciplined, ungenerous, and uninformed. If we cannot critique a president that way, then Lord have mercy on us. The humiliation of the church in America has just begun. Yes. We have to be able to call a spade a spade. To vote for a candidate does not mean we cannot critique them or hold their feet to the fire when they are incoherent, when they lie, when they sow seeds of division, when they use their office for personal or familial gain that has nothing to do with the welfare of this country. Voting is not a means of self-expression. It is not proof of residence to where you belong. That is, unless you write in a candidate that maybe you know. It is always a concession between candidates you did not personally choose. And while it is the beginning, perhaps, of political engagement, it is never the end of political engagement. And I think this has to be said especially for understandably disenchanted evangelical young people who are going to vote for Joe Biden in this coming election or some other party. They're understandably disenfranchised or disenchanted because they were told by their parents that you don't speak meanly towards other people, you don't make fun of people, you don't lie, and you don't cheat. And then the same people that have told them that those are part of the basic moral way of being in the world have now endorsed a candidate who routinely does this. That incoherence is pushing them away. But we have to realize if we vote for someone, we are allowed to critique them. We can push back. And so one, I think, very interesting, very helpful example of this are Democrats for Life. This is, you can't see it if you're watching this on Facebook, but those of you who can hear. This is a full-page ad from September 20th of this year, New York Times, a full-page ad that has over 100 elected officials who are Democrats, who have joined the Democratic Party, but are pro-life, and they are calling the leadership of the party to a more moderate position. They are reminding the party that actually nearly 30% of Democrats identify as pro-life. 44% of independents also identify as pro-life, and that 80% of Americans don't agree with an abortion at any time policy. They're challenging their own party to say, you claim to have space that is inclusive. Will you be inclusive of us? Right. Can we disagree on this and still work towards other common goods? So if we vote, if we join these or a political group, we can still push back. As people of faith, as Christians, we have our spiritual and existential needs met outside of the sphere of angry angry partisan politics. We do not vote and act in certain ways or believe things because we belong to certain political parties or affiliation. In that sense, we are politically homeless, but we belong to Christ. Our need for belonging, for a home, for a purpose, for an identity are met elsewhere than in the realm of angry partisan politics. That said, we join political parties in order to pursue a particular sort of political end, the promotion of multi-ethnic communities, care for the poor and the marginalized, grace and forgiveness becoming part of our cultural currency again. Whole life matters, care for the unborn as well as the elderly, and space for different sexual, I'm not sure how to say that the right way, but for the traditional Christian sexual ethic. And to belong to Christ is a belonging that's open to us as well as the culturally repugnant other. It is a belonging that transcends party differences. This, I think, animates some of what Paul says towards the end of Romans when he says time and again, welcome one another, knowing that we're different from one another. So I'm going to take a hard break and end by offering something of a liturgical audit for these final weeks of this election season. And by this, I mean an evaluation of the practices in our own life, in particular, our media intake. And I'm getting these ideas and these words from Caitlin Chess in her book, The Liturgy of Politics, Spiritual Formation for the Sake of Our Neighbor. And by liturgy, it just means any repeated, regular, embodied practice that we do, which includes watching the news and scrolling through Twitter and what we take in. And so this is an audit. These are questions that can help us make sense of what we're taking in. Because what we do with our bodies, these practices, it forms who we are. And so she offers these questions. Who or what is this asking me to love or to trust? Who or what is this asking me to hate or to fear? And what kind of good life is this describing? Sometimes that feels implicit in our political intake. I think these are helpful questions for us, especially in a time when there's often more heat than light in our political discourse.
Joshua, can you just repeat those for those who can't see?
For those who can't see, it's who or what is this asking me to love or to trust? Who or what is this asking me to hate or to fear? And what kind of good life is this describing?
I'm going to put them in the chat to your Facebook, those three questions.
Great. And I want to end just sort of circling back to Augustine and his book, The Confessions, which is arguably the first autobiography in sort of the Western tradition. And we can think about his story, the way that he told the story of his life, as this great life, someone with exceptional gifts, sort of an exceptional person who did amazing things that you'll never do because you're not capable of doing them. And those are often the type of stories that get turned into movies. But that's not what his story is. In many ways, his story, I think, more resembles the stories that are told weeknights in church basements at AA meetings, where people say, recovery stories, where people say, this week I messed up. And the response from the folks there is, I know, I've been there too. I know what it's like to mess up. Recovery stories function in a different way than sort of great life stories. Mm-hmm. And I think as we look out into a world where people feel so lost in the cosmos, feel as though they don't have a home in this unheimlich world, I think instead of just getting angry at them, perhaps because they're the culturally repugnant other, we can say we've also looked for a sense of belonging in those places, and those belongings haven't sustained us. But we found a different sort of belonging, which gives us a different sort of identity, a different sort of way of being in the world, and a different way of going about politics. So that is where I'm going to stop, and we can have a discussion for as long as long as I say, I suppose. But that is the end of my prepared statements. So if anyone wants to push back on anything, disagree with anything, help me think better about things, or have questions, yeah, let's chat. I saw Marty first.
No, someone else has handed up. Go.
Yeah.
No, this is just a very brief comment. I heard somebody refer to the position of those evangelical leaders that you mentioned, for whom the only issue is pro-life.
Yeah.
Is that it's actually pro-life until birth.
Yeah.
Because all those other issues that you talked about are also pro-life
Yeah.
issues. Pro-life is I mean, it's just another way of saying, I think a lot of what you've laid out is that pro-life is actually a very, very broad issue, which includes all the other things that the early church that you mentioned, that all the early church cared for, the poor and
Can include the environment.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, they didn't cover all the bases.
No, they didn't. They didn't have to think about it in the same environment. But.
Were you gonna say something, Ben or Dave?
Go ahead, Dave. It's not a question. I just thought that was very helpful. That those 5 points you listed, and how, one party might emphasize, well, maybe not even sufficiently 2, and another party another 2, but Christians were emphasizing all 5, but we're especially missing that middle one. That was really powerful. I think really helpful.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Ben, did you or no?
Yeah, first of all, just asking you to define it, or just spell out a little bit more what you meant by something about like the political discourse descending into whataboutisms.
Yeah.
Could you just explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Yeah, it seems so. Someone will point out something that's something that is just manifestly wrong in a candidate, and then instead of addressing that, they'll say, well, what about your guy on this, or what about this inconsistency that your tribe has, or what about, as a way to deflect. And and I understand that impulse, but I think the hope, I guess, is having a stable enough sense of self that when someone says you're wrong on this, or your guy's wrong on this, to say, I got to think about it. And I think sometimes the whataboutism also functions because on social media, and just everybody needs to have an opinion right away on everything.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes really hard to form a coherent opinion because you just need time. And so you need time to process what on earth has gone on. And you just don't know all the facts. So instead of saying, give me a little bit more time, let me do some research, let me look into this, you just say, well, what about the emails, or what about, and so that's all I meant by that.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah,
So,
something you see function in individual relationships all the time.
yeah,
So deflecting heat by just
and it like never ends because both sides, the sort of nonsense both sides go about doing is sort of endless.
Yeah.
So
Joshua, would you just mind telling people that are watching that they can put questions and messages, because there's about 20 people watching.
Okay, so if those that are watching, if they have any comments or pushback or questions, feel free to write that in the
comments.
In the comments. Yeah. So, Nick.
Yeah. I really loved your talk. When you first put up the slide and you were like, this is what I'm going to go over. I was like, wow, these are like individual lecture topics, but I really loved how you put it all together. My question is about like what you said about how like voting is not an act of self-expression or like representation unless you write in someone. Because and that was sort of interesting to me because it's like when whether you fill a bubble or you write someone in, like you're still choosing, and so like what difference does it make? I mean, it's kind of a technicality, but it's also interesting because it's like, if you write someone in, does that really mean that like they're they're like an expression or self-expression? But like, or do we have to confine ourselves to these like sort of two-party? Like, I don't know if you have any comments about that as like self-expression versus like we're confined to a menu of options, so we kind of have to just work off of that menu, and therefore it's not a self-expression.
I think I just meant it in the way that there's like 1,200 people running for president still. I think that
Interesting.
It's outrageous. And so my only thought was there are of those candidates, perhaps someone feels more like I could go 100% with this person, where the main two parties again it's choosing between two people that it's choosing to vote for someone that you didn't even choose. And so I just thought, if you write in a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, all the way party candidate, perhaps there's the possibility of more of like of an alignment or possibly an endorsement. But that's like a vote that I think has to be animated by a different. I still don't totally have all my like thoughts completely clear on this, but I do think being faithful looks different, and I don't think there is only one Christian way to vote. I think you can be animated in different ways. I think we have to have discernment and realize what when we vote for a candidate, where do we align, where do we disagree, and how can things we disagree with, how could we perhaps form a mediating institution to put some pressure on or show kind of move the party or move the candidate in a different direction to kind of hold their feet to the fire. But voting for a candidate that will lose, I think you have to have sort of a longer view of history, perhaps, than and understanding the significance of your political decisions are sort of given to you when you meet Jesus. Like, you don't know them in your lifetime, in a sense, and so I don't want to sort of discount third-party voting or anything like that, or 4th or 5th or 6th, whatever, because there's a lot. But I do think some of those candidates are also less controlled by super PACs. They're not beholden to all these investors, and so sometimes then they can speak, I think, with more of a coherent kind of vision. But I'm still figuring. I don't know. Do you have any more thoughts on that?
Well, I was just curious because, I mean, I think it's what you're describing in terms of like you have to be able to critique even the party you vote for. Obviously, that's very healthy, and that like we have to have that mindset going into it. But I was also curious because that was kind of like the main force of what you were talking about, and yet like it seemed like you weren't really describing so much of like you kind of like took this idea of like a full expression off the table. Like, whereas if there are 1,200 candidates that are running, like maybe there is one that is like a 99 or like 98% of like, or 90 whatever. Yeah. And like, what like value is it to vote for that person and actually have them be like a 95% or like 99%? Yeah. And like representation of what you might believe.
Yeah. Like, what is that?
Like, what's the value of doing that?
I mean, I think it has some integrity to it. Like, I can respect, and like I said, I think I think it is. I think the significance of much of the decisions of our lives, we don't really know what our decisions, the things we choose to do with our lives in general. Like that's something that's often hidden from us, and I think our hope is that in the world to come, when God makes things right, some of that will be shown to us. So the call to be faithful. So I think there can be an integrity there. So I think there's that, but I guess there's also other ways to sort of think about how to, like, strategically how to vote as well, knowing, like, I want to vote for this person even though I disagree with. I mean, I think the Democrats for Life are a great example of a group of over 100 elected officials. It's the governor, the main guy is the governor of Louisiana.
Oh, really?
John Bell Graham, I think is his name. Right here, John Bell Edwards.
Really?
And finding his name now made me lose my train of thought. But yeah, I mean, I think they are showing, like, look, we are not all in, but we do think this party will lead to more stability, more flourishing. Like, in a sense, the good can outweigh the bad, and the things we disagree with, we want to push against. And actually, it's interesting too. The Democrats for Life are not. It's not a faith-based organization. It's not. It's not primarily people of faith saying we're pro-life. It's actually just people with other, like, other sort of worldviews or religions who are Democrats, but also pro-life in that sense. So it's an interesting organization. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Did I ramble? I just feel like I kind of would get
good.
lost in my own sentence
Yeah.
there. But yeah, Nate, were you going to say something? And then, or...
Yeah, to be politically homeless sounds pretty lonely. Like, what would you suggest for somebody to find community of like-minded folks for support?
Yeah, definitely chat rooms on the internet. I'm just kidding. Yeah, I mean that's a good thing. I mean, I think if our belonging is to something that sort of transcends the political groups that we've been given. I have friends who are Republicans, like pretty hardcore Republicans, and we realize there's more to life than our political disagreements. I'm not even like a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. I happen to be registered as one, but I have some significant hesitations. Yeah, I mean, I think the hope is to find relationships that aren't just with people that, what was the term of it? Like, I used it, it's like the opposite of repugnant cultural other, just people that are just like us. Yeah, like agreeable cultural equivalent. Yeah. Like finding people that, like, you know, like basketball, like dumpster diving, like veganism, like thrifting, and like I do think finding kind of, I think those people are out there, and I think we're all that sense of, like, just general, like, existential loneliness or unheimlich or whatever, kind of lost in the world. I think we can all feel that, even if we have fairly coherent worldviews. Like, we can experience the world as a difficult place, as a place where we're very much alone, and I think that transcends the partisan divide. I think it's true on both sides. Yeah, Dick?
Yeah, it's a remark and then just another sort of question to throw at you. I think there's one interesting, I mean, we need to think of the role of a negative vote. I mean, if, for example, you presumably don't want to vote for Trump, you don't need to believe Biden would be perfectly ideal, but your vote doesn't count against Trump if you vote for Mitt Romney. Mm-hmm. It doesn't count against Trump unless you vote for Biden.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to add to the.
Why is that true though?
It's not a two-party system.
Because we're limited to this in this two-party system, and if Biden doesn't beat Trump, nobody's going to.
So to vote for somebody else is
Is a
To
throwaway.
throw away your vote, really.
It's a throwaway vote.
Kind of
It's in
in
the,
terms of resist. Yeah.
No matter how much you like for the other person.
yeah, in terms of like the next 4 years of American
Yeah.
Right.
American life. Yeah, but I just also want to respect people that sort of know what they're doing, or they're going into that like completely sober and know that in a sense that's what it's going to do, but that again the significance of all their political action, all their life is given to them ultimately by God. And so I don't know.
I'm not dictating what I'm just saying this is a
that's a
perfectly good
reality.
motivation.
Yeah.
I have another question. Though.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes from the ways I've said some similar things in lectures standing where you're standing
Okay.
in the last while, which is that I've argued hard, I think as you would, and by implication, for Schaefer's idea of being co-belligerents.
Yeah.
You can be a co-belligerent with all sorts of person without being a full ally. You mentioned ally once, which means you're not going to be standing with both feet in any one party.
Yeah.
Because I would say I'm pro-life, but I'm also very pro-environment, and it doesn't. That means I'm
It's
homeless.
no party.
Yeah.
And I've been criticized, as you may have heard that happen. Well, that means you have to step out of your engagement in the two political parties, and you render yourself powerless. And it's one thing if you want to stand here as a liberty worker, as we do, and say what we think. But if we want to be actually engaged, you've got to be part of one of these parties and get into their package somehow. And getting free from their package means you sort of remove yourself from leverage on the system. And I felt that very much. I mean, we've had some people here who felt very strongly against what I was saying for that reason. And I think about it afterwards, and to do with the question here, we can do a lot without, even if first of all, people in each party we need like Democrats who are pro-life
Exactly.
in the Democratic Party,
Absolutely.
pulling within the party, trying to
That's right.
exert influence within the party, as we need people who are Republican who need to be
For the
who are
environment.
environmental interests. And how can we expect the party to toe the line or come closer to us if we're not willing to go in and get our hands dirty or be labeled wrongly or whatever? The other thing is that there's yonks, and this may be what gets into what you mean. There's all sorts of organizations that are attached to these issues but are not attached to the party. In other words, look at the issues that are engaged in the environment and exerting a political influence on pro-life, who are not members, are not joined to one party at the hip, but do and every other issue that we could be concerned with. There's ways to have other people with us and not have to stand alone.
Yeah. Good. Over there. Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is kind of pulling the room, and you kind of talked about this at the end, so sort of expanding on it. Since it is so divisive and it is so easy to find your home in a party, how do you or everyone start conversations with people who have found their home in a party and who are sort of digging deeper and deeper regardless of, the president's actions? Because I feel like a lot of times it feels like we're like coming from two different senses of like reality, you know what I mean?
It is two different realities.
And so it's hard to feel like I can say anything without getting angry or like taking it very personally and like you're for Trump and you're against me because I'm a woman. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, and you run up against these blinders, as I'm sure people do all the time talking to me too about whatever. Yeah. So I have just not had very much success in that area.
I mean, my father-in-law is sees the world very differently than I do. I love him, I respect him, and we had a strong conversation in 2016. And one of the questions he asked me was, and this just, I think he in many ways is like an exceptional person, so I don't know if everyone could sort of ask this, but he just said, what do I not see? Like, what do I not see? Help me see what, and that just like was very helpful, and there was just a disarming through that question, and I've used that question myself in speaking with others. But yeah, I think part of my hope is in framing this through the fact that we feel so many of us experience the world as unhomey, as different, and so we look like it. Hopefully, that humanizes people that are drawn, especially to the extremes.
Yeah.
I just saw a clip, some pictures. So did you see a week ago? I mean, it feels like it was a month ago, but it was probably a week ago or more, about this militia in Michigan that was trying to kidnap the governor, and the FBI was moving her around so they could gather more information. Sort of like white nationalist, anti-mask, pro-Trump militia. And they all got arrested. You know, they wanted to kidnap the governor. It's just, but they showed pictures of where the arrest happened, like the guy's home. And I mean, he's just living in squat, like his home is. He's deeply impoverished, and it's like, I could see why this guy would look to sort of radical right-wing politics to help ease the pain of having to live in this place and maybe not being able to provide for his kids, and like the pain that comes from that. That in no way excuses or justifies or downplays the fact that he tried to kidnap a governor. Like it's terrible. Like
and put her on trial.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's just. Yeah.
For treachery, I think, for being a traitor. Treason.
Yeah, and just so. Yeah, hopefully trying to sort of. I don't know. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts, but I'm really curious to hear from other people. Maybe folks over here now.
Well, I was just going to give a question on Facebook, especially because Dick brought up co-belligerence. Someone's asking on Facebook how you would assess the legacy of Francis Schaeffer in the development of single-issue politics that you are critiquing, because he's saying that later Schaeffer works seem to steer in that exact direction.
I would have no idea. I'm not adequately read in Schaeffer, especially later Schaeffer, to know that. But perhaps we disagree. We see things differently. And also, the late 80s were a different cultural moment than where we are today. But that, so.
Yeah.
Before going further down that, does anyone else want to respond? Okay, go for it.
What? This might be taking it down a different
This is
trail.
too.
But could you just speak a little bit about, engaging with this topic and civility? Because I feel like this, every particular election season, it does seem like the question of civility comes up, but it just seems like more and more, like engaging in civil dialogue is just thrown out the window. So I'd be curious, like, to hear kind of your thoughts on. I think the forgiveness piece really gets to this, but
I mean, I really like being angry. I like how it makes me feel, to be honest. and I like being angry, especially at someone I don't know, or someone who really I could never get more of a whole picture on, or who sort of can be encapsulated by a tweet or some ridiculous thing they've done. Like, I like being angry at people like that because it makes me feel better about myself. But that I think has formed like a disposition in me that is very judgmental, and quick to be angry, so that when I have to actually speak with someone who's different than me, who sees the world differently than I do, it makes civility even harder. And so I feel like I have had to sort of put some boundaries or have some sort of liturgical audit, though I wouldn't have used that phrase or that words had I not read this very helpful book by Caitlin Schiss. To sort of ask what's going on within me. But I just think too, like, I think there's legitimate reason for a lot of people to be very angry. Like, I don't think it's illegitimate all the time. I don't think anger is all wrong or all bad. But there's it's very easy to inherit someone else's perhaps justifiable anger and make it your own, and that I think that comes through watching clips on social media, through and I don't know, it gets all the juices flowing. But then anyway, saying all those things, I think that makes civility hard, but without some sense of a shared humanity, a common good, there's no reason to be civil. I think, and I think when we, I'm trying to think of, well, I'm sort of struggling to know how to say it without putting people on blast, so to say, and succumbing to it myself. Can I circle back to that, or can anyone else? Does anyone else want to say something about
I just
civility?
wanted to make the observation that I think what you just modeled in reflecting on your own anger is what you said. How self-examination is necessary political work, and so like I think that is a really helpful thing for us to reflect on. You know, like what are my juices? You know, that I like to drink and feed. But yeah, I think I mean I just wonder, like, even being able to step back enough to ask someone, like, what are they really worried about, you know, when at the end of the day, you know, to try and get to that sense of what are the things that are motivating each of us, or worrying us. Like, those are points of connection, I think.
Yeah, and I guess I feel like without some desire for civility, which comes from like it maybe even civility isn't the right word. Maybe more just like not retaliating, or not like, it's just treating someone with dignity, even when they're acting pretty foolishly and stupidly and wrong-headedly. But I just think without that, like, this summer we saw a 17-year-old boy with an automatic weapon that he was legally not allowed to own cross the state border and shoot a protester, and then and then we also saw sort of a MAGA protester who was killed in Portland, and neither side. I just feel like without some necessity to civility, to non-retaliation, to working together, like, violence is just the next option. If you don't have a moral imagination that wants to sort of find other ways to engage. And I mean, this is where I think we all need some real lessons from the civil rights movement. Like people talk about people that embodied non-retaliation and grace and forgiveness, to, like in the face of both ignorant but highly calculated and sophisticated evil. And so I don't know. I think I'm just rambling now, but yeah. Anyone want to say anything about either civility or helpful tips talking with folks that are just dug in on the other side? I don't want to run past that, Eleanor.
Yeah.
I think Marty's trying to.
Yeah. Oh, Marty.
say
Yeah.
things.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking, we talked to our son in Georgia recently, and his pastor is a very wise guy. He's been preaching a series of sermons on politics, and he is working in a town in Georgia where there's been huge racial problems. It's the town where this runner, Ahmaud Arbery, was gunned down by some, chased and gunned down. And our son and a lot of people in the church were involved in protests after that. But the pastor has been very careful not to come out and say who he's voting for, kind of thing, but trying to really encouraging the congregation to not just talk to people that see things the way they see it, not just listen to one, not only listen to Fox News or not only listen to NPR, but actually listen to the other side. And so what he's encouraged people to do and he's helping them find each other in the church, is spend time with somebody who sees things completely differently. Mm-hmm. So our son Tim got a call from the pastor saying, there's this man, he's very conservative. He says he doesn't know any liberals. He's never talked to a liberal. He doesn't know what a liberal is. Would the pastor suggest someone that he could meet with? And the pastor suggested our son Tim, who is actually very pro-life, was giving pro-life talks in high school here, writing newspaper articles in secular schools. He's also an environmentalist. He's and a very, thoughtful Christian. So they have got together. They got together for a meal. This Republican who'd never met a Democrat and who didn't think Christians could be Democrats has met together with Tim. Tim feels the same way. Joshua, he has problems with the Democratic Party, but at any rate, he was, quote, he sort of got a laugh out of it. He was the liberal that the conservative got to meet with. And they had a very fruitful conversation. And actually, as they talked, this guy said he just never heard a lot of things that Tim said. And maybe Tim had never heard some of the things this other guy said, but he wanted to get together again. But I thought that was a really helpful thing to do as a church. Now, unfortunately, a lot of churches only only represent one party,
Right.
So you maybe have to branch out to some other churches if you want to have civil conversations with Christians who are committed to the theological view that we're all images of God, we're all fallen. So there's got to that baseline theological recognition that this person I disagree with is still an image of God.
Yeah.
And I am an image of God, but I'm also fallen. I have blind spots. And so does this person have blind spots. So it's sort of getting a level playing field in terms of trying to get some humility at the ground level. But anyway, I thought that was sort of a good idea, an interesting idea, and a helpful idea.
Because so much of our, I think when we're beholden to, parties, it's about winning for our party, and we forget that, I think a lot of people are already sort of preemptively celebrating Biden's, victory, which
isn't there yet.
It's not there yet, but it's not like that's going to make all of our problems go away.
Not at all.
There are some massive social problems that politics can help, but cannot, I think, adequately by themselves fix.
Yeah.
And we have just, without having civility or without a sense of the other side, we've either followed sort of the most extreme voices to the extreme, or we've just felt ourselves pushed to the extremes. And I think there's a lot of relationships that could I don't know, people need to be in relationships with folks who see the world differently than they do.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something,
Yeah,
Ben?
just a couple things. Just one thing that's interesting about that story is that it seems to me like if the whole purpose of the interaction with somebody else is to engage on politics, it's a very difficult time to get anywhere because people of opposite political poles just know how to push each other's buttons. I may come in with an absolute determination to be civil, and then they said this. Like, how could I? Not? And so it seems to me like they're I don't know. Civility is much more likely to happen in conversations between people that have some sort of like relational something to lose. Relationally, you know what I mean? Like some sort of relationship that is not just about the political conversation.
Yeah.
Which would motivate us to listen longer, and maybe. I mean, a lot of it's about self-control, honestly. About not, trying to get out of our heads and hearing. Okay, so this is what I want to say, and I may be convinced of its truth, but how is this other person going to hear it? And then what are they going to say in response? I don't know. I was going to say, can I take it a little bit of a different direction? Or
Can I say one thing and then go right back to it? I do think what is helpful are, to use some of Dick's language, like exemplars of human excellence, especially in this area. So we have models, we have heroes, we have people who we see embody the sort of civility or the ability to absorb the very easily strewn political vitriol. So like spending time, in all seriousness, spending time with Mr. Rogers and seeing like how Fred Rogers confronted all sorts of evils in his day, especially kind of trying to help children navigate them. Or the civil rights movement. I've been quite captivated this last year by this woman named Anne Atwater, who's worth looking up, and there was a movie made about her life that I haven't watched yet. But she was a woman who, a black woman who was an activist in in Durham, North Carolina, and 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education, schools had not been integrated in Raleigh, and she was asked, the guy who was put in charge of it, who came from the federal government, took the head of the KKK and then Anne Atwater and said, you guys have to figure out how to integrate the schools or I'm going to force it. Wow. And her way, she is just a strong, powerful person, but part of that is because she's compassionate and she, her power is in part her ability to forgive and absorb, but she befriends this guy, CJ, I forget his total name, out of the KKK, and they become lifelong friends. They become best friends. She was the only person at his funeral who wasn't an immediate family member. Because he had no friends, because he left. He found belonging in the KKK, and she showed him a different way. So I don't know. I think part of if we want to be civil, we have to shut off the nonsense of on Twitter. We have to not listen to some of these Christian leaders who maybe in the past were helpful for us, but I think at least on this point have proven to sort of not be faithful witnesses. And so I think I really find Justin Giboney, who's the head of the AIM campaign, he's a lawyer and political strategist in Atlanta, and he is a very gracious, thoughtful. He's a big man. He played football at Vanderbilt. He's incredibly articulate, and he just comes out. He comes out of the black church. He comes out of a tradition that's very different than mine, and he sees the world quite differently. But he's been very helpful. So I think finding people who embody this sort of way you hope hope to go about learning civility, learning
Yeah.
how to have hard conversations. I think that's at least one way in, and those are, a few people that have been helpful for me. But Ben, did you want to take another direction?
I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a pastor recently, and we were, I think, had some different views politically, but a lot in common. And it was an interesting conversation. But one of the things he raised that I like to throw it out there too is just because I totally agree with the things you said about sort of one issue politics, and it's basically the idea that if you're a Christian, it's a simple choice of just figuring out which candidate is pro-life, and that's your choice. That's your choice, And I was sort of like, well, similar to what Marty and Dick were saying, that if you're really pro-life, it means is a vast array of different things we should be concerned of. If we're actually concerned with human life, not just a fetus, right? And so in this conversation with him, I used the word flourishing, which granted is kind of a buzzword among Christians today. It's all about flourishing, human flourishing, and his response was, well, there's and I agree with this. I think the word flourishing can be used so vaguely to mean anything that I think is good for people, and can kind of be a way of not wanting to think about the sort of black and white nature of abortion. Which is like there's all kinds of debate about environmental issues, to what extent it's a concern, to what policies would actually serve creation better, similar debates around racial justice, what would actually be better, but when it comes to the abortion issue, it's an absolutely black and white thing that's being done, and it's just less ambiguous, and so I think for me, I wanted to say, well, there's all kinds of aspects of human flourishing that should impact how we think politically, not just abortion. And I think to my friend, it sounded like I was just kind of throwing the gate open wide to anything I feel is good for people. It's all about flourishing, and not really taking seriously the gravity of this one issue, because you could claim all kinds of different things were about human flourishing that actually aren't biblical at all. You could say human flourishing is all about abandoning any kind of sexual norms and just letting people do whatever they want. That's about flourishing, right? Of course, you need to define what you mean by that, and of course, there's a very definite biblical understanding of what flourishing would entail. But I just would like that's not really a good question, but what are your thoughts on that, on the use of that word, particularly, because I want to say, actually, if I am pro-life, I should be concerned about the environment, I should be concerned about racial justice, because all of it has to do with human flourishing.
Yeah.
And life. So
but
life.
not all those issues have to do with just killing people outright.
Yeah.
And
I don't want to. This is not your friend, but if there's any, it feels to me like if there's debate of all right, they want to say, I care about racism, and I care about what was the other the environment, but I'm not sure about which policy sort of pursues that the best. Mm-hmm. I would just want to say, I think that's actually true about the abortion issue. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm not sure there's been as much. I mean, even the current president, part of his COVID treatment was stem cells from an aborted child. So it's not like he is this bastion of pro-life. And
Absolutely.
he this week did not. He sort of danced around when he was asked by Savannah Guthrie about overturning Roe v. Wade, and just And it's just not, to me, in this case, there's no clear pro-life.
Yeah.
There's not a pro-life option, I don't think. But then I just don't think, I'm less convinced that, I mean, statistically, there's less abortions now than there were when Roe v. Wade happened. So there's been a decline. And what contributes to that decline, I'm less convinced, is just by having a pro-life president.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's probably other sort of state legislation. I think it's this idea of mediating institutions, about advocacy groups that will sort of walk alongside mothers.
That's right.
And help them not just through the pregnancy but after the pregnancy.
Yeah.
And I think so. Then also the coupling of like the pro-life ticket with often meager sort of social network to help
That's right.
help the poor is completely hypocritical.
That's right.
And
Absolutely.
it's one, maybe it's at least to me, I have not heard a case on why those would go hand in hand. They seem to make no sense to me. Maybe saying they're hypocritical is sort of strong, is too strong. But you get the sense that it's sort of like, we are going to walk with this, we care about this baby for the first 9 months, and then when it's born, it's got to pull itself up by its bootstraps, and it's got to contribute to society.
Yeah.
Like, it can't just be a mooch. And that is,
That's right.
like, it's crude, but it does feel as though sometimes it's sort of the same thing. So I would just at least want to say, policy-wise, or approaching the pro-life issue is just not as simple as a presidential candidate saying one thing.
Right.
That's also because I think the death penalty is a pro-life issue.
Absolutely.
I think war is a pro-life
Totally.
issue. I think
Environment.
like police brutality is a pro-life. Like, all of these things have to be. It's sort of like one or the. You can't get the great title of pro-life and just sort of say it's only about one thing. And so then, in regards to the language of flourishing, I think it's a super fair point. Like, you can define flourishing in any number of ways, but I think that at least the intention, and coming from someone like you, like, I think there's some substance to, like, or some particularity on what flourishing looks like. It's not a sort of choose your own adventure understanding of flourishing. And I mean, part of that is because of like broadly speaking, the Christian tradition has some things we've agreed upon about what a good life looks like, and that has had to change, like, because we've not been as we haven't followed through on. I'm thinking particularly of slavery. I think of the civil rights movement, but so I would agree that flourishing can be thrown around, and it can just be like an empty word. But I think what it intends is that it shows, like, so often we quantify our society by, like, gross domestic product and all of these things.
Yeah.
But, like, yeah, so, and this is where I get frustrated with pro-life people that say, you know, pre-COVID, the economy is the best it's ever been. Well, for one, it hasn't. It was better in the Clinton era. But the economy is better than it's ever been. That is not human flourishing, because, like, suicide rates are higher than they have ever been. We are not like it is just we made up these means by which we're going to quantify what our success in society looks like, and we can get rid of them. We made them up like 50 years ago. They're not from on high. They're not that old, and so I just think that's absurd. Yeah, the economy's doing better than it ever has, but, like, wealth disparities are also higher than they ever have.
Exactly.
And so, like, that can't be like the only means, I think. And so I get that, like, flourishing can be an empty, it's like a junk drawer word. You just put in it whatever you want it to mean. But having some sort of language that says there's more to a society there's more to life, there's more to a culture than just like economic prosperity.
Yeah.
And that is just, yeah, and yeah, political privilege, I think too. Like being privileged is something that Christians and especially the white Christians, white non-Catholic Christians in America have had a pretty sweet go of things, and having to let go of some of that is, I think, also not easy for people. But yeah, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say along those lines, like, with something that does feel so black and white, like and is in a lot of ways so black and white, like abortion, it can feel like we're contributing to human flourishing by making a blanket statement of making this illegal. But then in so many other ways, I mean, you can be like criminalizing a pregnant teenager, or you know, having a very unsafe illegal abortion happen. And so I think like when we try to like compartmentalize human flourishing into like certain platforms, you like miss, which is kind of what you were saying too. It's a lot more holistic and involves a lot more intersectionality than we ever, you know, talk about.
Yeah, and I think the way that issue is often framed in political discourse, you're either pro-mother or you're pro-child.
Right.
And I just want to say, like, I don't buy into that. I want to be pro. I want to be pro both. Like, I think so.
Feminists for Life. I highly recommend this organization, Feminists for Life, pro-woman, pro-life. And it's, they're not a Christian organization particularly, and they're not Democrat or Republican, but they're a great organization.
Yeah. Dave?
Yeah, I just think that just working towards more civil discourse happens when we do start to acknowledge that other positions are caring about things, have values. It's not like we have values and they don't. Or they, you know, we're all trying to emphasize what we think is valuable. We might not be paying attention to other things, but to acknowledge that, to say, oh, you know what, actually, you care about something. And maybe even ask, like, what's the story there? I think if someone's really angry, there's a story there to be heard, and it's maybe hard to hear. That might not always help, but I think I've seen people, their anger comes down when you start asking, well, how did you get here? What got you to this point of being so angry and worked up? But I think it also, it's hard. I think there are multiple values at work, and even when you come to that point, it's still very difficult, because now you're like, well, what should I put as a priority? Because there are real values in conflict in the world, and now we have to make choices. We have to vote with that as a reality, and that's and it's to take that into account for other people. So not just to maybe, I know people vote, and it sounds like they're a one-issue voter when it comes to abortion, but it might be that they're like, I care about all these things too, but I just feel this is so important. I'm voting with this as the most weighty thing for me, even though I care about the environment, you know. So I just think it'd be good to keep that in mind too for people who have abortion up front, but it might not be that they don't care about anything else.
Right.
Just like other people are they're voting with something else in mind. And it's not because they don't care about anything else, but they just think this is more significant, or this pulls more weight. To have that in our minds for other people.
Yeah, and I think like those folks need like a good PR campaign to sort of let folks know that is, because like when it's framed through your pro-mother or your pro-child, to both sides, the other side is not just, the other side is immoral. Like it's offensive. Like how could you, you know, like, and so they're coming at it with totally different moral taste buds, totally different moral frameworks, and different values. And so to find ways, I think what you're saying is great, to find ways to acknowledge That it's not that you're just some like degenerate who doesn't care. Or what. It's like you actually are someone with. When I grew up, conservatives were like the moral ones, and Democrats were kind of like loose. And I feel like somewhere along the way things have changed pretty dramatically through sort of the libertarian stream in republicanism, and then through especially the last 4 years, like that like supposed moral high ground, moral majority, family first stuff really has sort of fallen away, and so I think the left often has like the moral high ground in discourse, or at least perceived to. And I think to a generation younger than us, it definitely does. And so finding ways to acknowledge that, but then also having a PR campaign to say, hey, we're not just like, I don't know, to change the perception, so that people know, even if this is the main reason why I'm voting, I still care about these other things. And I think the alignment with conservative politics has made it hard for people to say that. It's made it hard for them to say, I care about these other things as well. I don't know.
Yeah, like in the fire department, you have priorities. So if you go into a fire, your number one priority is life. You're like, is there a person in the building? That's our priority. Then the second priority is the building. We're going to save the building if we can. The third priority is the exposures, everything outside of it. So it's like the fire department would say, it's not we don't care about exposures or a building, but it's like, man, our first priority is this life. And so I think that's in work in everybody's mind. They've got these values, but they've got these priorities worked out, and we don't all have the same ones. And so I think it's good to acknowledge that and realize that's what's at play. And how do we deal with that?
I just wanted to say something to the question about Francis Schaeffer being a single issue person. I don't know if this will get the person that asked it, because again, as you said, it was a very different time politically. He was obviously very engaged in the pro-life issue, but we heard him say over and over again, he could never belong to a church that was racist. He stood very much against racism, welcomed Africans, such a people came to L'Abri who were treated with great dignity. And he also is the first evangelical to write a book on environmental responsibility. He wrote Pollution and the Death of Man, which was the first evangelical book on the environment. So he was not actually, he wasn't in his person. We knew him well. We heard him on and on. He was not a single issue person, but he was very engaged in the pro-life issue at the time.
What he did push for was wanted the freedom to think through each individual issue as a Christian biblically.
Right.
And not be pushed into a package.
Exactly.
And not be able to do that. But then not to say that let's choose one and make that the whole thing, our whole political agenda. Right. Let's put them all together and then do the best we can in terms of who to vote for. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't single issue politics that you've been arguing against here, of it's only the abortion issue that we need to care about, forget everything else.
Not at all.
It's rather, I want to be able to biblically wrestle with every issue and not being told by a party and what I should want to vote for. Yeah. Also, on this, I think backing up what you were saying, one of the problems in the Christian right, going back to the Falwell Senior, that so many people have said, is that they thought if we change the laws, we will win.
Yeah.
All we need to do is change the laws.
Yep.
And many people from within it have said, you forget that we've got to change, what we really want is change the culture. And then they'll want the right laws. Yeah. And that's much harder to do, to change a culture. And nobody has the patience for that or the love for that. To change what people actually want.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, even if Roe were thrown out, that just puts it in each state's hand. It doesn't end abortion. Yeah. And our danger is that we will so drive people crazy by our animosity that we will have very little cultural leverage. And I think that's already true.
It's already
particularly
true.
With the Trump years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the church has been shamed in the ability to evangelize, let alone
Absolutely.
have a cultural influence.
Yeah. Yeah. Nick?
Yeah, my comment is sort of just building on a couple of things people have said, but particularly Eleanor, sort of your question about like how do you respond to people who are, maybe opposite voting for a candidate that you would be particularly against or feel particularly victimized by. And I wonder if part of a way of responding is taking sort of what you're talking about as we can't view voting as a sort of holistic like self-expression, and not just applying that to our own voting but applying it also to other people's voting.
Like extending grace.
Yeah, because I mean, if we're going to apply it to ourselves and say, okay, we have to be able to vote even if we disagree with that candidate, then we have to be able to apply that same understanding to someone else.
Yeah.
And like that's a hard thing to do, because like there are candidates that I don't want people to vote for, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, if we are going to apply that to ourselves, it feels like we also have to apply it to other people and enter into those conversations, even if they're voting for someone who we would say is a racist or whatever. It's like, okay, well, are they critical of that part, or are they actually pro that part?
Yeah.
And then get more into the details of, and not view, like, it's really easy to sort of apply that sort of self-expression grace to ourselves. Like, okay, well, I'm voting for this candidate, but like, I'm critical of this part of them or whatever.
Yeah.
But not apply that to other people.
Yeah.
And it seems like if we are going to apply it to ourselves, we have to apply it to others as well.
Yeah, which has to come through conversations, which maybe have to be strategically organized by pastors or by other. That's a great. Yeah, Winter.
A couple questions ago, when we were talking about Ben's friend and that whole idea of flourishing, like right at the end of that, you mentioned it was a couple of questions ago, but you mentioned something about a lot of white non-Catholic Christians having to give up certain privileges, and I was just wondering if you could expand on that, because there might be a few white non-Catholic Christians in the room.
I think I just meant like that in many ways the people with the most sort of power to make the laws, to enforce the laws, to benefit from the laws have been white Protestant Christians, and so there's a sense that is being for some folks in that category. There's a sense where that privilege that they've had is being taken away or being threatened. Their way of life is being threatened, and that is an understandably hard thing to let go of. So that was sort of what. Does that make sense? Or,
yeah. Do you feel that's like common with people who are white Protestant Republicans, like in your experience?
So this was a profoundly boring book. It's called "Taking America Back for God: Christian Nationalism in the United States." It's by two sociologists, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. I mean, it's not the most boring book, I suppose, but it's like
not the most boring ever.
Yeah, not the most boring ever.
Alright.
But I thought it would be significantly less sort of like academic sociology, with everything being with tables and graphs and charts and stuff. But that's what it turned out to be. But they argue for something called Christian nationalism, which is sort of a loose, in some ways it's a loose sort of broad category, but they would say that category of these people, it's also an equation, sort of an equating of America with it being like a particularly chosen nation by God, so we have a particular sort of divine origin and a divine call. It gets conflated with the culture of white Protestant Christians. They're trying to make the point that sort of loose belief system is actually not Orthodox Christianity, and actually has some pretty heretical strains to it, or it can manifest that way. Thinking of like the Republican convention this year, where the vice president reframed the words of Hebrews and said, instead of fixing our, let's run the race before us, fixing our eyes on the cross, he said, fixing our eyes on Old Glory, the American flag. And so they are arguing that group of people, that sort of, it's broad, like they have benefited quite a bit, and they are not wanting to let go, even though as their numbers sort of continue to decrease. Did that answer?
Yeah.
I just feel like I spent all this time reading this book and just being like, what is this book? It's so boring. I just wanted to bring it into one thing tonight.
It was worth it.
It was like $6 on Amazon. But yeah, so anyway, does anyone else have any other thoughts or comments or questions? Or if not, what's that?
I feel like we could talk about this all night.
Yeah, that's a good, well, yeah,
I wanted to ask you, so we're gonna vote on the first Tuesday in November. Do you have thoughts for the first Wednesday in November?
Yeah, the first Wednesday. Yep.
Some votes will still be being counted, actually. Absentee ballots.
Or along the lines of what you said of, our citizenship isn't just our voting, that is an important part, but so the candidate we vote for doesn't get elected, or does get elected, how to live, how to wake up the next day.
Yeah, so that's a good, it's a good question.
Yeah.
It's a good point from Marty. I think we'll probably have to punt it to at least 2 weeks after the election. I think there's going to be a lot of contesting. That has been clear.
We should pray, though.
We should pray, that perhaps
it's clear enough.
But yeah, the last, I'll just say this as a bit of, maybe I can end on this bit of confession. Last election, we watched the election in this room. We watched the results coming in. I was holding my nose, voting. This might lose any credibility I have with a lot of people. Voted for Hillary Clinton, assuming she was going to win. I was not excited. And when she lost, I was so shocked and so surprised. And the next morning at breakfast, we served breakfast to the group of Liberty students that were here, and there were people that had been up crying and were so hopeless and so shocked and so disappointed and gutted, and I realized I was too, and I struggled to know what to say, and so I have decided going in to this year, whatever, I mean, maybe I'll put this, whoever wins, because I don't want to say whatever happens, because there are some potential scenarios that could happen that are very bad. Very, very bad. We saw some hints of that potentially with this militia trying to kidnap the governor. But yeah, I want to wake up the next morning and know that God is in control, that Jesus is Lord, and that my politics are not determined either by who's ever in the office, in the sense that I want to go with them, or that I just want to say the exact opposite of what they do. Like, my politics come from a citizenship in heaven, and my work is to spread the culture of heaven in a world that is unheimlich, and try to make it a place that more resembles the home that God wants that the world was made to be, and that it will one day be again. So I'm just not gonna, as long as there's an actual decision that isn't followed by like mass violence, as long as there's a peaceful transition of power. I really hope there's a transition of power,
Absolutely.
but as long as there's I will say my morning prayers and enter into the day, because it's another day that the Lord has made for us to rejoice and be glad in. So maybe we'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So is Heimlich related to the Heimlich maneuver or not?
It's a great
That was my main question.
question.
He actually